For over 100 years, every Egyptologist on Earth believed the age of great tomb discoveries was over. They believed the last king's burial chamber had already been found back in 1922, when Howard Carter pulled back a stone door and saw gold glinting in torchlight inside the tomb of Tutankhamun. Since that day, nothing like it had happened. Again, not once. Generations of archaeologists spent their entire careers in the Valley of the Kings without finding a single new royal burial. Some of them started to believe it was simply impossible, that everything left to find had already been found or destroyed, or buried so deep under rubble and rock that no living person would ever reach it. Then, in a stretch of dry, forgotten wadis near Luxor, a team of Egyptian and British archaeologists walked into a tunnel filled almost to the ceiling with rock and hardened flood debris. And what they found at the end of that tunnel didn't just end a century-long drought of discovery. It rewrote what we thought we knew about a king. History had almost completely forgotten. This is the story of how scientists found the lost tomb of Pharaoh Thutmose II. And it's also the story of what happened right after, because once that tomb was opened, the discoveries didn't stop. They kept coming, one after another, each one stranger and more consequential than the last. By the time you finish hearing this, you'll understand why Egyptologists are calling this the most important stretch of years in Egyptian archaeology since Carter's flashlight beam first hit gold. Let's go back to the beginning, to the moment nobody expected anything at all. The team working in the area was led by Dr. Piers Litherland, who headed the British side of a joint mission called the New Kingdom Research Foundation mission to the Western Wadis. They were excavating in a remote area west of the Valley of the Kings, not exactly a place anyone expected to find a king. When they first broke through into the tomb, what greeted them was not gold, not treasure, not a preserved mummy in a golden mask. It was destruction. A 30-foot-long corridor, packed almost to the roof with fallen rock and the compacted remains of an ancient flood. For a while, the team didn't even think they'd found a royal tomb. Based on some of the early signs, they assumed they were looking at the burial of a minor royal woman, maybe a wife or a lesser member of the royal household. Nothing about the initial impression screamed Pharaoh. But then they kept digging. And piece by piece, the story the tomb was telling began to change. As they cleared deeper into the burial chamber, they noticed small surviving patches of painted plaster still clinging to the walls. In one corner, barely intact, was a tiny section of ceiling painted deep blue and dotted with yellow stars. That single detail mattered enormously to anyone who understands 18th dynasty burial customs. Royal women's tombs from that period, spanning roughly 1550 to 1295 BC, were never decorated this way. Starred ceilings, in particular, were reserved exclusively for kings. It was a small clue, but it was the first sign that everyone had been wrong about what they were looking at. Then came something even more specific. On the chamber walls, the archaeologists uncovered fragments of a text called the Amduat. If you're not familiar with it, the Amduat is one of the most important funerary texts in ancient Egyptian religion. It's essentially a guidebook for the dead king, describing his perilous nighttime journey through the underworld as he travels to reunite with the sun god at dawn. This text appears almost exclusively in royal tombs. Finding it here was the second major sign that this wasn't the resting place of an ordinary person. It was built for a king, but signs and clues aren't proof. Egyptology, like any real science, demands more than a strong hunch. The team needed something concrete, something with a name written on it, and eventually they got exactly that. Buried among the debris, archaeologists found fragments of an alabaster jar. When they pieced the fragments back together, they could make out a dedication carved into the stone. It described a great royal wife making the monument for her brother, described as the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, using his throne name. Shortly after, they found the curved rim of a second alabaster jar, carrying an almost identical dedication from the same queen to the same husband. There was only one queen in Egyptian history who was also the sister and wife of a king carrying that particular throne name. Her name was Hatshepsut, and the only pharaoh she was ever married to was her half-brother, Thutmose II. That was the moment everything clicked into place. This wasn't an anonymous burial, this wasn't a minor royal, this was the long-lost tomb of Thutmose II, the missing pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, a king whose funerary temple had puzzled and eluded Egyptologists for over a century because no one had ever managed to locate his actual burial site. Dr. Mohammed Ismail Khalid, the Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, called it one of the most significant archaeological finds in recent years. And there was a very specific reason his statement carried so much weight. Before this discovery, not a single piece of funerary furniture connected to Thutmose II had ever turned up in any museum anywhere in the world. Not one object. For a pharaoh, that absence was staggering. Every other 18th dynasty king had left behind some trace of his burial goods somewhere in the historical record, even if scattered across different collections. Thutmose II had left behind nothing, which meant this tomb wasn't just a new location. It was the very first physical evidence of any kind tying grave goods to this specific king. To understand why this pharaoh had been such a mystery in the first place, you need to understand who Thutmose II actually was. He was the son of Thutmose I and a secondary wife named Mutnefret. He held the throne for a relatively short reign before his half-sister and wife Hatshepsut effectively took control. Most historians and Egyptologists believe Hatshepsut wielded much of the real political power, even while he was alive, and after his death, she didn't just remain in the background. She took the title of pharaoh for herself, becoming one of the most powerful female rulers in ancient history, and in a controversial move that still fascinates historians today, she had her own name inscribed over many of her late husband's monuments. In a sense, Thutmose II had been partially erased from history by his own wife, replaced on his own buildings by the woman who succeeded him. Finding his tomb, after all this time, felt like finally locating the missing piece of a story that Hatshepsut herself had tried to rewrite thousands of years ago. Now here's where the architecture of the tomb itself tells its own story. Litherland pointed out that the tomb has a surprisingly simple design. A passage leads down into a burial chamber that sits about 1.4 meters higher than the floor of the corridor leading into it. At first glance, that might sound like a minor architectural detail, but it turned out to explain something crucial about what happened to the tomb after it was sealed in antiquity. At some point, long after Thutmose II was buried, the tomb flooded. Water poured into the corridor and chamber, and the height difference between the burial chamber and the passage floor actually helped ancient workers move the tomb's contents to safety, including the king's own remains. This wasn't unique to Thutmose II. It was actually part of a broader, well-documented pattern in ancient Egyptian history. Priests and officials, worried about flood damage or tomb robbery, would periodically move royal mummies to safer, hidden locations, sometimes centuries after the original burial. In this case, Thutmose II's remains were eventually relocated to a site known as the Royal Cache, designated TT320, near Deir el-Bahari. There, his mummy joined the remains of other rulers from the 18th and 19th dynasties, all hidden together by ancient priests trying to protect them from looters. His mummy sat there, undisturbed and unidentified in terms of its original tomb location, until the 19th century, when it was rediscovered along with the rest of the royal cache. So here's the strange twist in this whole story. Archaeologists had actually had Thutmose II's mummy in their possession since the 1800s. What they didn't have, until this recent discovery, was his actual original tomb, the place where he was first laid to rest before the flood forced his relocation. That's what makes this find so historically significant. It's not just a body, it's the architectural and archaeological context that had been missing for over a century, finally giving researchers a physical space to study, alongside inscriptions, wall paintings, and material evidence that can tell us about his reign, his burial practices, and his relationship with Hatshepsut in ways the mummy alone never could. And archaeologists were quick to point out the scale of what this meant historically. This marked the first time since 1922 that anyone had discovered a pharaonic burial site. Not since Howard Carter and his Egyptian excavation team pulled back that famous stone door into Tutankhamun's tomb had the world seen anything like it. A century of searching, a century of near misses, a century of assuming the well had run dry, and then suddenly, in the western wadis outside Luxor, it happened again. But here's the part of the story that turns this from a remarkable discovery into something even more tantalizing. While excavating around the original tomb, researchers began finding indications of something else nearby. Evidence pointing toward a second burial chamber buried beneath an enormous mass of rubble, something in the range of 23 meters deep, deliberately concealed by the ancient Egyptians themselves. If that second chamber exists, and if it turns out to be undisturbed, it could represent the first untouched royal tomb discovered since Tutankhamun's. Think about what that would mean. Every other 18th dynasty royal tomb that has ever been found has already been robbed, disturbed, flooded, or emptied out by ancient priests, relocating the contents for safekeeping. An untouched chamber, sealed and forgotten for over 3,000 years, would be almost unprecedented in modern archaeology. As of now, this remains an active area of investigation, and archaeologists are being understandably cautious about what they promise until the excavation confirms what's actually down there. But the possibility alone has kept Egyptologists around the world watching this site closely. Now, while all of this was unfolding near Luxor, something else was happening roughly 250 miles south in a completely different part of Egypt. And this second discovery adds an important layer to the story because it shows that Thutmose II's tomb wasn't an isolated miracle. It was part of a genuinely extraordinary stretch of archaeological breakthroughs happening across Egypt at nearly the same time. In the ancient city of Abydos, one of Upper Egypt's oldest and most sacred sites, a joint Egyptian-American archaeological team, directed by Professor Joseph Wagner of the University of Pennsylvania, uncovered another royal tomb. This one belonged to the Second Intermediate Period, a turbulent era in Egyptian history dating to roughly 1640 to 1540 BC, when the Hyksos dynasty controlled Lower Egypt, while a separate, lesser-known royal line, now referred to by historians as the Abydos dynasty, held power in the south. The tomb was found buried about 23 feet underground, inside the Mount Anubis necropolis. It was a limestone burial chamber lined with mud brick vaults, originally standing about 16 feet high, and notably larger than other tombs known from the same period. Everything about its scale and design pointed toward royal ownership. But there was a problem. Ancient tomb robbers had thoroughly ransacked the site, and in doing so, they had damaged the hieroglyphic inscriptions that would have named the king buried inside. The king's name had originally been recorded in painted scenes on plastered brickwork decorating the entrance to the burial chamber, but not enough of the text survived for researchers to read it. So, unlike the triumphant naming of Thutmose II, this tomb presented archaeologists with a genuine historical puzzle. They knew they had found a king, they just didn't know which one. Mohammed Abdel-Badai, head of the Egyptian Antiquities sector at the Supreme Council of Antiquities, suggested that the tomb likely belonged to a predecessor of King Senebkay, whose own tomb had been discovered in the same general area back in 2014. The style and location of the newly found tomb closely resembled Senebkay's burial, reinforcing that connection. Two names emerged as leading candidates, kings known to history as Sennacherib and Penjeni, both of whom are known to have commissioned monuments at Abydos during this period. But Professor Wegner was careful to point out that the ancient robbers hadn't just taken the king's treasures, they had taken his mummy and his sarcophagus too, stripping the tomb of nearly every clue that might have definitively confirmed the king's identity. As it stands, the Abydos tomb remains an unnamed royal burial, a reminder that not every archaeological mystery gets neatly solved, even when the discovery itself is undeniably real and undeniably significant. Interestingly, this wasn't the only find in the area. Around the same time, archaeologists working nearby in the village of Banawit uncovered an entirely different kind of site, a Roman-era workshop used for producing pottery and glass, dating to somewhere between 30 BC and 642 AD. It wasn't a royal tomb, but it turned out to be one of the largest production centers of its kind in the region, complete with multiple kilns, storage areas, and 32 inscribed pottery fragments known as ostraca, documenting commercial transactions and tax records, written in Greek and Demotic scripts. Later, the site appears to have been repurposed as a burial ground sometime around the 14th century, with archaeologists uncovering mud brick tombs containing mummies and skeletons, including the remains of a child buried in a fabric cap and the skull of a woman estimated to be around 30 years old at the time of her death. It's a smaller story compared to the royal tombs, but it adds another layer to just how much ancient history was surfacing from Egyptian soil during this same remarkable period. Taken together, these two discoveries, the confirmed tomb of Thutmose II and the unnamed royal burial at Abydos, mark what many Egyptologists are now calling one of the most significant stretches in the history of the field. Consider the timeline here. For over 100 years, from 1922 until the confirmation of the Thutmose II tomb, not a single new pharaonic burial site had been found anywhere in Egypt. Then, within a matter of months, not one but two royal tombs came to light, one belonging to a well-documented but physically elusive 18th dynasty king, the other belonging to an entirely unknown ruler from a shadowy, poorly understood dynasty that historians are still working to fully reconstruct. And this pattern of major discovery doesn't appear to be finished. Renowned Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, one of the most prominent and at times controversial figures in modern Egyptology, has publicly claimed that another major discovery is coming, this time from inside the Great Pyramid of Giza itself. Speaking at a panel discussion, Hawass described what he called a newly detected 30-meter-long passageway inside the pyramid, found using advanced scanning equipment, ending at a door that he claims will, in his words, rewrite a chapter in the history of the pharaohs. According to Hawass, his team used state-of-the-art technology, including specialized robotic equipment, to access areas inside the pyramid that had never before been reachable by human researchers. Hawass has been especially vocal about two long-standing goals of his career: the discovery of the tomb of Imhotep, the legendary architect credited with designing the Step Pyramid of Djoser, considered the oldest pyramid in Egyptian history, and the discovery of the tomb of Nefertiti, one of the most famous and mysterious queens in all of ancient Egypt. Hawass has claimed to possess evidence supporting the existence of Imhotep's tomb specifically, and has suggested that finding it could rank among the most important archaeological discoveries in history, potentially even surpassing the significance of Tutankhamun's tomb. It's worth being clear about where this particular claim currently stands. Unlike the Thutmose II tomb and the Abydos discovery, which have both been physically excavated, confirmed, and documented by Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, the Great Pyramid Passageway claim remains, for now, an announcement rather than a confirmed excavation result. Hawass has stated that a formal announcement will be made sometime in 2026, but as of this recording, that confirmation has not yet been made public in full detail. Egyptology, as a field, has a long history of bold claims that eventually needed revision once full excavation and peer review took place. So while Hawass's track record and reputation carry real weight, this particular discovery is still one to watch rather than one to treat as fully settled fact. Still, taken as a whole, the pattern emerging across Egypt right now is hard to ignore. A tomb hidden for over 3,000 years, belonging to a king whose burial had eluded researchers for more than a century. A second royal tomb, unearthed just months later, belonging to a ruler from one of the most obscure periods in Egyptian history. And now, potentially, a newly detected passageway inside the most famous pyramid on the planet, hinting at chambers no living person has ever entered. It raises an obvious question, one that archaeologists themselves are asking. If the tomb of a pharaoh as historically significant as Thutmose II could remain hidden and unconfirmed for over 100 years of active searching, right in the heart of one of the most thoroughly studied regions on the planet, what else is still buried out there? How much of ancient Egypt's history is still sitting quietly beneath the sand, waiting for the right team, the right technology, and the right amount of persistence to bring it back into the light? For over a century, the story of Egyptian archaeology seemed to be a story that had already ended, its greatest chapter written back in 1922 and never repeated. But what's happening right now, near Luxor, at Abydos, and potentially inside the Great Pyramid itself, suggests that story is far from over. It might, in fact, be entering one of its most important chapters yet. And if the pattern of the last few years is any indication, this almost certainly won't be the last hidden tomb that scientists find. It might just be the beginning of a new golden age of discovery in one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. So here's the thing. 100 years passed between Tutankhamun's tomb and the discovery of Thutmose II's. 100 years of archaeologists walking the same valleys, scanning the same hillsides, and coming up empty. And then, almost out of nowhere, within the span of a few months, 2 more royal tombs surfaced. One confirmed with the king's name carved into alabaster. One still nameless, still waiting for someone to figure out exactly who was buried there. And now there's talk of a hidden passageway inside the Great Pyramid itself, sealed behind a door nobody has opened yet. If you stop and actually sit with that, it changes how you think about the ground beneath your feet, or at least the ground beneath Egypt's. For 100 years, people assumed the great discoveries were finished, that everything left to find had already been dug up, looted, or lost forever, and they were wrong, completely wrong, which means the next obvious question isn't whether there's more out there. It's what else is still down there and who's going to be the one to find it. That's exactly why stories like this matter and why I want you to stick around for what comes next. Because this isn't a closed case. The second chamber near Thutmose II's tomb, buried under 23 meters of rubble, hasn't been opened yet. Nobody knows for certain what's inside. The Abydos tomb still doesn't have a confirmed name attached to it, and there's a real chance future excavation season finally settles that mystery. And Zahi Hawass's claim about the Great Pyramid, that 30-meter passageway leading to an unopened door, is still sitting there unresolved, waiting on an announcement that could either rewrite Egyptian history or turn out to be far more modest than the headlines suggest. I'm going to keep following every one of these stories as they develop, because that's what separates real archaeology from clickbait. Real archaeology takes years. It takes teams of researchers cross-checking inscriptions, dating pottery, piecing together broken alabaster jars, one fragment at a time until a name finally emerges. It's slow, it's careful, and it's exactly why when a confirmation like Thutmose II finally happens, it actually means something. So if this kind of story pulls you in the way it pulled me in, do me a favor and subscribe, because I'm not done with this one. The moment new information comes out about the second chamber, or the moment Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities confirms or denies what Hawass is claiming about the Great Pyramid, I'm going to be covering it in full detail right here. You won't have to go digging through a dozen unreliable sources trying to figure out what's actually confirmed and what's just speculation. I'll break it down for you the same way I just did with this one, straight from the archaeologists and the official statements, no exaggeration added on top. And if you want to go deeper right now, don't just take my word for any of this. Look up the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities directly. Look up the New Kingdom Research Foundation's work in the Western Wadis. Read what Josef Wegener and the Penn Museum team have published about Abydos. These aren't obscure sources buried in academic journals nobody can access. Egypt's antiquities officials have been remarkably open about sharing these discoveries with the public, probably because they know exactly how rare a moment like this is. 100 years without a new royal tomb, and then 2 in less than 1 year. That's not something that happens quietly, and it's not something you want to just scroll past. Drop a comment and tell me which mystery you want solved first. The identity of the unnamed king at Abydos, or what's hiding behind that 23 meters of rubble outside Luxor. I read every single one, and honestly, your guesses might end up being more accurate than some of the theories currently floating around in the field. Because if the last few years have taught us anything, it's this. Ancient Egypt still has secrets left. And we are, right now, living through the moment some of the biggest ones finally come out of the sand.